Subscribe to our YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to get all the latest updates.
The third round of talks between military commanders at the line of actual control has been held today, but there is no sign of a resolution or of China pulling back from its clear transgression into Indian territory, virtually trying to redraw the acceptable and agreed contours of the line of actual control in several areas in eastern Ladakh. For those who thought that the Prime Minister's national address might well address the issue of China, this after 59 Chinese apps were at least temporarily banned. That did not happen. The Prime Minister's comments remain focused on the coronavirus pandemic, the unlocking of the country, and special economic schemes related to free rations across the country. In other words, from the government itself, at least from the highest levels of government, we still do not have an official account of what's happening on the ground in Ladakh. Thus far, this has depended on journalists and analysts and strategic affairs experts piecing this together. With military options limited, there are increasing sentimental demands for an economic boycott. The ban on the Chinese tech apps is seen as one move in that direction. Can this happen? Chinese are so entrenched in the supply chain of India that there is now a fear that Indian companies may end up getting more hurt. Indians could lose jobs instead of just hurting the Chinese. How should India play it from here? We have three of the most informed and wise people to help us decode this. We have Professor Brahma Chellaney, one of the foremost experts on the India-China equation, Dr. Sanjaya, who is, of course, a veteran journalist, has also been a media advisor to the Manmohan Singh government, and General Satish, a former corps commander based out of Kashmir. I'll start. I'll start with you, Brahma Chellaney, if I may, because you have welcomed this ban on the apps, as have we all. But if you look at the data, and you know all of this, it doesn't even begin to address the tip of the iceberg. When you look at, let's say, the smartphone industry in India, 86% of that market is captured by Chinese companies. Out of the top 5 telecom companies that manufacture smartphones, 4 of them are Chinese. Our drugs, our antibiotic production is dependent on imports from the Chinese. Our trade deficit, of course, was close to 57 billion last year. So if we restrict this just to the banning of apps, what does that really mean, and what does that achieve?
The ban on the apps is just a warning shot across China's bow. It might lead to more concrete actions that might impose significant costs on China. So far, India's bark has been worse than its bite, and the latest action is largely symbolic, as you rightly point out. India has to start imposing costs on China. For years and years now, China has been having its cake and eating it too. It's been containing India, encircling India, while raking in growing profits from a booming trade relationship with India, which is a very lopsided trade relationship that China enjoys. It sells manufactured goods to India and imports raw materials from India. It treats India as an African basket case, as a raw material appendage to its economy. And we have never tried to impose any costs on China. And I think we need a fundamental shift in our China policy. And I think this ban on apps is just a slap on China's wrist, but it could be a warning that India might start now imposing costs on China.
But would you then say that the next logical step would have to be to look at companies that have Chinese investments? Now, one report suggests that the Chinese investment in startups, in tech startups alone, is $4 billion. Some of the prominent names, as you know, that have major Chinese investments are Paytm, Zomato, Snapdeal. The tech startup environment in particular is dominated by the Chinese, Brahma Chellaney. So are you advocating that as a next step?
I'm advocating economic distancing as opposed to an economic boycott of China. Economic distancing involves reducing your dependence on China for essential imports, looking for substitute suppliers, and also constricting market access for Chinese companies. If you look at Chinese FDI in India, FDI, it's quite small, a fraction of their yearly trade surplus with India. According to the Chinese government figure, as released this year in January, the total Chinese FDI in India is only $8 billion, while they're enjoying a trade surplus that is currently running at over $60 billion. So they haven't really invested much in India.
Mm-hmm.
So these PTMs and other companies, startups in which there is Chinese money, there are not too many of them, about 2 dozen of them. Of course, economic distancing does not mean that we target these companies, does not mean that we squeeze everything that's coming from China. What it means is that we should try to restrict non-essential imports from China. Right now, 60% of China's trade surplus with India comprises exports of non-essential items to India. So we need to restrict the imports of cheap goods from China, and where we are dependent on critical supplies from China. For example, our pharma industry needs raw materials from China. We have to either start manufacturing those raw materials at home or look for substitute suppliers. So it's going to be a long, drawn out process. It won't happen overnight. It'll take a long time. It'll require clear government thinking. There needs to be a strategy behind economic distancing.
Now, Dr. Baru, let me take that to you. You have on this program previously called the otherwise effective communication strategy of the Modi government a disaster. That was the word you used when it came to both the pandemic and the handling of China. When Professor Chellaney talks about a clear strategy, do you see any evidence of that? Because the fact of the matter is that when you look at what's happening in the Galwan Valley, where the Chinese are back, having pushed the edge of the line of actual control from the patrolling post 14, which used to form the agreed edge of the LAC, to now clearly the Y junction, which is 1 kilometer below. This we know from being reporters. We do not know this from government. We do not have an official account of what's happening on the ground. So, we're dependent on sources. Sources are sometimes contradicting each other, and that's what's going on. Do you believe, or are you picking up any reason to believe that the government has shifted gear? It's understood that its military options are limited, and it is moving now towards what Professor Chellaney calls economic distance.
Well, first of all, on the whole issue of communication, I continue to maintain that don't see any strategy as far as the government is concerned. Even today, the expectation when the Prime Minister announced yesterday that he would be addressing the nation, the expectation across the country, the media particularly, was that the address would have some relationship to the situation of the borders. In fact, I had calls from various channels suggesting that there would be a discussion on China. And then suddenly the Prime Minister discovered Jean Drèze's proposal, which is now 2 or 3 months old, of spending more money on the poor, and devoted his entire speech to poverty relief, curiously ending saying that he'll go on till Chhat Puja, which is in November. And Chhat Puja is something important for Bihar, as you know. We in the south don't even know what Chhat Puja is. So, the link with Bihar election and poverty alleviation. So, I'm confused. I'm sure a lot of people around the country, around the world, would have thought that at a time like this, when the situation with China is on the front pages, the Prime Minister of the country addressing the nation, that too telling 24 hours in advance that he will be addressing the nation, would have expected something on China. Now, complete silence on that subject, and talking about an issue which has been discussed for now 2-3 months, which is for the government to spend more money on the poor. What is the messaging there? I don't know. I mean, is it that the government thinks the whole issue of the border situation is such that the Prime Minister doesn't have to talk about it, that it's being handled all right, we are satisfied with what is happening? Or is it that the Prime Minister does not want to talk about it? So I'm a bit confused at this stage after having heard him as to what was the purpose of a national televised broadcast, at a point like this. On the whole issue of economic distancing, I broadly agree with whatever Dr. Chellaney has just said. I would only make 2 points. One is that we are both members of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization allows countries to impose barriers to trade or under certain circumstances where national security is involved. Pakistan, for example, has invoked national security to deny India most favored nation treaty. We have not yet done that with China. China continues to enjoy, as far as we are concerned, most favored nation status under the WTO, and we enjoy that status. So we still have normal trade relations with China. But we are increasingly suggesting to the people of the country that they should boycott Chinese goods, which I think is quite understandable, and I'm fully with the sentiment. There's a lot of anger with what China has done, and the killing of Indian soldiers simply not acceptable. And therefore, a public sentiment that we will not buy Chinese is I think, a correct political step to take. But this is not going to hurt China. Let's face it, the total trade between the two countries is less than 3% of China's world trade. If we are part of some global boycott of China, which is led by the United States and other countries, that's a different matter. But as of now, we do not see that happening. The US-China trade war is going, but there is no global boycott of Chinese trade. So therefore, I'm not convinced that this will actually hurt China. But it is an expression of national sentiment in India with which I'm fully on board. But to imagine that this will alter China's behavior, I don't think so. I think we need to do much more to China's behavior.
So in other words, General Dua, we are left with a symbolic expression of national sentiment when it comes to the banning of these tech apps. Dr. Baru points out that the asymmetry of economic powers and the trade deficit, unfortunately, being what it is, that unless the world puts its weight behind this boycott, it will not inflict damages on China. Now, that takes us to what the military options are. And we are all aware, without giving away any details, that there is a massive build-up. But we're also aware that mountain warfare basically means that there's no such thing as a raid. This is not the LOC. This is the line of actual control. It's not delineated, but there is an agreement, and China is now interfering with that agreement. For example, what we're seeing in Galwan. Galwan Valley was not one of the previously contested areas when it came to defining the line of actual control. General Dua, what do you believe is happening militarily on the ground? Obviously, the military is preparing for the worst while hoping that it does not have to ever fall back on.
Military always prepares for the worst while we hope for the best. But our contingencies, our drills are always catered to the worst of the end of the spectrum that could take place. What is happening at the military front? We know it's filled the national discourse over the last 1.5 months or more. At Galwan, like you rightly pointed out, that which is not one of those 23 mutually agreed areas of different perceptions. So we haven't had a face-off there earlier. What actually happened at Galwan, I know everyone knows it. I'm just trying to put it in a different perspective, that once the 6th June meeting took place, we decided to disengage. There is a certain disengagement protocol that gets decided by meetings at different levels thereafter. We have to monitor that the disengagement is taking place as per that plan, and it's a step-by-step process. It's a longish process because of the verification that is required at every step. During one of such verification processes, things went ugly, and we all know what happened. And not only it went ugly, passions were roused. Deaths have been caused for the first time on both sides. So the process on one hand, that is disengagement process, obviously got stalled. And we have heard of reports of the Chinese build-up at the rear. We are obviously not talking about what we are doing. We are also doing our actions. We are taking our military actions the way we should operationally. When things went ugly at Galwan, thereafter, the talks have taken place. Disengagement is a slow process. It is on, not only here, also at Finger 4 and 8 area. That process will take time. Now, what actually everybody wants and I've been saying that on several channels, and I spoke with you also once on this. What everybody wants is a blow-by-blow account. That's the only thing that will satisfy the citizenry. I don't blame them, but the fact of the matter is, operational details perhaps military cannot bring out like that, and it's not desirable while things are in process. Even today, let's say there was a statement. I'm not going to comment on what the Prime Minister's statement was. Imagine today, we don't want a, at least I would say, we don't want a detailed account from the Prime Minister of what is happening. For instance, general level talks are going on as we speak, or as Prime Minister's address was going on. I don't think there we could have expected, that's my way of looking at it, there we couldn't have expected some very strong statement on China. And in any case, whether we want to take a statement on economic front and other statements like this will happen in a focused manner, like Dr. Chellaney and Sanjay Baru brought out. So I will leave it at that, saying that disengagement will take time. It will turn, there will be kinks in between. Sometimes disengagement, it takes a longer time. I remember in sharing a space with General Malik in one of these channels, and he described an incident that after Kargil war was over, everybody had decided they would pull back, and you were there. Perhaps you'll recall this incident. A day or two after that, we had to actually carry out an action to evict them. There was a certain post that was not moving. So things like that do take place, and it's a prickly process. It'll take time. We'll have to have patience without asking for blow by blow operational details all the time.
Okay, let me take that to Dr. Chellaney and Dr. Baru. Dr. Chellaney, I think it's nobody's case that we would like operational details. I do think that some of us believe that a government should take its citizens into confidence, at least about the problem. Maybe not the solution, maybe not the approach to deal with the problem, but at least to say the Chinese have transgressed. I at least would have wanted to hear those three words from the Prime Minister at some point. Maybe not today, maybe at some other point. After all, when Kargil happened, there was an acknowledgement that the Pakistanis were on our territory. Why should we not be able to acknowledge officially that the Chinese are indeed on our territory? And when we saw India's ambassador to China, Vikram Misri, trying to make this point, the government agencies turned their anger on the news agency that carried the interview instead.
Absolutely. I agree with you fully. You covered Kargil, and you know what happened during Kargil. Vajpayee, as soon as India discovered the Pakistani intrusions, went public. He took the nation into confidence, and that's how you rally the nation. Now, in this case, we are facing Kargil too, but this time the culprit is China. We were caught napping like we were caught napping during Kargil. In the second half of April, the Chinese came in. We discovered in early May that the intrusions had occurred. Instead of taking the nation into confidence, we tried to cover up the Chinese aggression. There was a series of developments that happened in May, quite disturbing. I will not recount them. But the Prime Minister's infamous speech of June 19th was a culmination of nearly 8 weeks of efforts or 7 weeks of efforts to cover up the Chinese aggression. I initially thought the Prime Minister's speech was an attempt to give China an opportunity to withdraw by letting them save face. But I think now I conclude that the Prime Minister of India was trying to save face himself at home by not acknowledging China's intrusions and encroachments. Now, that hands China a public relations coup, a propaganda coup. Imagine an aggressor enters stealthily, occupies portions of your front yard, and you decide not even to call out its aggression. So that really works well for China. So unfortunately, we've had 2 rounds of encroachments now. The first round happened in the second half of April, and we've had a second round of Chinese encroachments in the second half of June, especially after the Prime Minister's speech. It's not a coincidence that after the Prime Minister's speech, 2 things have happened. One, the Chinese have encroached on the Devsan Plateau. Second, the site of the clashes of June 15th, which both the PMO and the MEA said was on the Indian side of the LSC, today is under the control of the PLA. So when we said that the soldiers' deaths will not go in vain, what did we mean? Because now the very site of those clashes has come under Chinese control. So we have to face up to the truth. Obama 2 days ago said something very important. He said, in a crisis, a leader should always speak the truth. I think it's very important for our leaders to take the nation into confidence and to expose China's aggression. If India does not call out China's aggression, who will? We should launch a diplomatic offensive globally to exert pressure on China, to shame China, to build sufficient pressure on China to increase our bargaining leverage. But we're doing the
Okay.
opposite.
Let me take that to Dr. Baru and General Dua. Dr. Baru, but again, money talks. And the numbers tell us that the Chinese have invested close to 100 million in investments in Afghanistan, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, in the Maldives even, in Bangladesh, right? So the Chinese are literally paying their way through this region. I'm not even talking about Pakistan because Pakistan is a vassal state of China, so I take that as a given. Now, I think at least you and Dr. Chellaney agree that the communication strategy has been mishandled. General Dua has a slightly different take. What are our options right now? You have diplomats like Nirupama Rao who actually say that we have to be cognizant of this asymmetry, and maybe this is the time to mediate a permanent border sentiment. I just think that public sentiment would just not allow it at this point.
Well, the time for a permanent border settlement is always when a political party feels absolutely confident about its position, which is the position in which Mr. Prime Minister Modi was in the summer of 2014 and in the summer of 2019. That was a moment when there was hardly any challenge to his leadership in the country, and he could have in fact said that we are ready to look de novo at all these issues and settle all our differences, because there is a parliament resolution going back to 1993 which prevents any government from actually arriving at a settlement, which means you need a new parliament resolution. This government had the numbers in parliament to get a new resolution to say, give the government the authority to renegotiate the borders. See, the real problem, Barkha, is actually an Indian problem, which is that all of us have to accept a new map of India when the final settlement is done. And the political leadership of the country has to convince the people of India why that new map makes sense in the long-term interest of the country. Those are all very difficult leadership issues which a political leadership can only take when it is riding high, when it has absolute majority in parliament, when the opposition is on the defensive. That was the situation in May, June 2014. That was the situation in May, June 2019. We are no longer in that situation. Today, the government is on the defensive. The very fact that the Prime Minister addresses the nation on extending a poverty relief program, the way in which at least most people who understand or analyze these things will read it, is that either he's saying poverty is a bigger problem for India than national security, that right now the focus of the government is on poverty, and that's a message not just to the people of India but to the rest of the world, or he's saying I want to divert attention away from my real problem. That is the way in which people read it. It may be fair or unfair, but the way in which people read this intervention today is to suggest that the Prime Minister wants to focus on issue other than China, and that is why he focused on poverty. So I think the political moment when really difficult decisions could have been taken has passed us. Maybe there will be another future political moment. When that political moment arrives, the leadership at that time has to take difficult decisions.
So
There
can
are
I ask you,
options.
can I ask you, Dr. Baru, where do you think the economic options lie beyond the banning of these tech apps? And that also is interim. TikTok now says it's been called for talks with the government, right? So we don't even know how permanent that is.
all economic options as levers of diplomatic pressure, etc., are symbolic when it comes to China. India does not have that leverage that it can hurt China economically. Let's face it. We can certainly make it difficult for Chinese to sell their products in India, and there I'm fully with the government in having the sentiment be Indian, buy Indian. That's fine. Every country in the world does that, but that's not going to hurt China uh, because overall trade relationship is not such that we can hurt China. There's a very famous study of economic sanctions done at the Peterson Institute in Washington that shows that in the last 50 years, the only success story when it comes to economic sanctions was the universal sanction against South Africa on apartheid. Other than that, there have been very, very rare examples where economic sanctions have contributed to geopolitical changes or change in the political approach of a government. Iran today has been facing American sanctions for so long. Has Iranian behavior changed? So will Chinese behavior change because of India's economic sanctions? Unlikely. I mean, not at all likely. So I don't think it's about getting China to change its behavior. It is really about sending a message to the people that we no longer regard China as a friend. But
Yeah.
at some point, you have to have a normal relationship with China. China is your neighbor. I've always believed that we need normal relations with both Pakistan and China. And the long-term objective has to be to normalize these relationships.
Well, at the moment, that seems very, very difficult, given what's happened and given what is happening. General Dua, if you were that commander on the ground holding those talks, round three, what would you be looking to do? You'd obviously be looking to restore status quo ante. But the elephant in the room is this: if the Chinese refuse to restore the status quo, uh, you know, I'm not one of those sort of broadcast anchors who's going to do any loose talk about war. We are talking about an inordinately treacherous terrain. We are talking about peaks that range from 14,000 feet to 18,000 feet. And we are talking about a country that is already battling a pandemic, that is already has a flagging economy. What realistically are our options on the ground, General Dua, as a military man?
Look, it is not that these contingencies have not been thought of, militarily speaking, or not been planned for. We obviously have planned for each and everything. The militarily, we plan if things go wrong, what will happen. So there is a range of options from suboptimal kind of options that we would have to something that goes beyond that border or beyond beyond the spectrum that we plan for. What I'm trying to say is that if we plan on a local action, let's say you are painting a situation where they decide that they will not disengage. All right. So we have to plan for a full range of options, military plans for if there could be a local skirmish, or if a war is to break out. Please remember, Barkha, it may not break out on land over there. I'm just taking it hypothetically. The first thing that will go into, that will get called is the Air Force. So we are looking at a very different kind of options. It doesn't work as simplistically as you imagine that go and push out a few tents. That is the kind of thing that has already taken place. So we are looking at something that will go a little beyond control. Army, or shall I say military, because Air Force, and even then we'll have to look at Navy far down below in the south, have to swing into action. So for all that, military has plans. Military is prepared. A lot of build-ups have taken place, and it has been coming out in the media. But the fact remains, it's a nation call. What we wish to do. The military, on its part, is fully ready to take on any eventuality, whether it is COVID situation or not. The national security comes first. And I don't think military would be ready, or any nation would be ready to compromise with national security. We are trying to disengage by a manner of mechanism that we have followed in the past and which has worked okay for the last 10, 15 years that we started having these face-offs. This time it has turned very ugly. As to your interpretation as to how much they have come in and how much they have not. Yesterday also I was trying to explain. We will leave that because the one who should be speaking is not speaking. That means there should have been an official statement. and that is why media is
Yes.
taking out lat long and putting out things like that. So we leave it at that. All I want to say is we are prepared. Military is prepared. And if disengagement as it planned is not taken off, then it will be a then it's a call to be taken as to what's to be done.
Okay, let me give the last quick word to Dr. Chellaney. We're at the end of the program. I think what I'm picking up here is Dr. Baru saying economic pain is mostly symbolic. General Dua saying as a good military officer that the military is always ready. Realistically, realistically, where do you see us going from here, and where should we go from?
If the tables had been turned and China had committed aggression against India while enjoying while India was enjoying a large trade surplus with China, how would China have reacted? China would have immediately imposed economic sanctions on India. It would have actually launched a diplomatic offensive against India. It would have tried to impose even military costs on India. There's far asymmetry between India and China. But wars are not decided by economic and military capabilities alone. Modern history is replete with examples of the weaker side triumphing in a war. Look at Vietnam. Vietnam defeated three great powers after World War II. First France, United States second, and China in 1979. Wars are not decided by, by economic and military power alone. In fact, in the 1950s, China's comprehensive national power was much less than India's, and yet it gobbled up Tibet, it occupied Aksai Chin, and thrashed India in 1962. India has the requisite military strength today. India has one of the world's largest and most experienced mountain warfare armies. India packs more experience in mountain warfare than the PLA. The problem is that we have directed the army commanders not to escalate, thus allowing the PLA to escalate its encroachments. As the Global Times said 10 years ago, that China knows that India will not fire the first shot. That gives PLA so much advantage to keep encroaching because they know that as long as they keep encroaching, India will, as long as they keep encroaching without firing a shot, India will not react. India will not open fire. So it allows the aggressor to expand its aggression. And I think when we say, as the Prime Minister said on June 19th, that we have given the army a free hand, that is not true. The direction is do not escalate. Do not escalate means you're tying the hands of your armed forces. And as far as the economic and diplomatic costs are concerned, why is India quiet on Hong Kong? Today, Beijing passed a new law in secrecy that creates a completely different situation. They have changed the entire dynamics in Hong Kong, but you will not hear a word from India. Why are we silent on the detention of more than 1 million Muslims in Xinjiang, in concentration camps? Why haven't we spoken up? If China was in India's place and India had done that to Muslims, you could be sure that China would have spoken up. For example, since from August to January, China took the JNK issue to the Security Council 3 times. Once there was a discussion, twice they failed to have a discussion in the Security Council. So we need to change our approach to China. Economic costs can be imposed in tandem with what the Americans are doing. The Americans are trying to ensure that China ceases to be the hub of global supply chains, and India can contribute in a major way to achieving that goal.
Well, they used to say about the coronavirus pandemic, break the chain. When it comes to China, you have to do two things. You have to break the chain on the virus, and you have to break the supply chain on their domination of markets. What is clear, and after listening to all three of you, I feel this even more than before, is that the Modi government is actually facing its most serious, most complex national security challenge thus far. And what is sad, I think, and I don't say this just as a journalist, but as a citizen, is that the government is not acknowledging the gravity of what we're actually looking at. And I do hope they listen to the council on this panel and at least start by saying that there is a problem, because there is no discussion possible on the options available to a country when its citizenry has not been told officially what the problem is. We'll have to leave it there, Dr. Baru, Dr. Chellaney, General Dua. A pleasure. I know we're going to have many more moments to have this conversation, because this problem isn't lifting like the summer clouds. That's not happening. Thank you very much. Pleasure talking to all.